Hi, thank you for joining this week's Agility Tea Time. I am your host, Lakeisha Lynette Beeler. And this week we're going to be talking about states' rights versus federal rights, or the state's constitution and the federal constitution. And I'm going to specifically be addressing states' rights in the post Reconstruction era. So this was after the Civil War, and these are states' rights, specifically in southern states, because even you'll see today that in the southern states, there a lot of times are Republican states, they will a lot of times try to state that they're fighting for states' rights. But this is something that goes back to the post Civil War era, right after the Reconstruction. And so the reason why I'm focusing on that is because now in our nation's history, we are going through some massive upheavals. And a lot of these changes and a lot of these problems actually stem from the laws that were placed on the books prior to the end of slavery, but a lot of them actually came right after slavery, because prior to slavery, there weren't really any laws necessary that needed to be on the books pertaining to the Black population, because the Black population really was not considered citizens. So when the Constitution was drawn up, it was not really drawn up to give Blacks rights. It was really drawn up to deal with the white population. So it was after the Civil War that the laws now took into account these newly freed Black people. And they were really created to control the labor and to control their movement. So you may have heard of things like Black codes. The Black codes and Jim Crow laws, these were actually creations of this ideology of states' rights, always wanting states to have the right to be able to pretty much monitor themselves. But what this came from is the fact that after the Civil War, the federal government and these Union soldiers were pretty much policing the South, for lack of better words. But the South didn't like that, because it actually hindered them from being able to deal with these newly freed slaves the way that they wanted to deal with them. So after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and the new president, came into place, I think it was Andrew Johnson, if I'm not mistaken, fact check me on that. But the president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated was a Southerner, and he wanted to admit the South back as soon as possible. And so there was a lot of leniency with these Confederate states. Now, once they were admitted back into the Union, speedily they started putting laws on the books to control and monitor newly freed Blacks, which rolled back the rights that they had been given by the U.S. Constitution. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment gave Blacks some rights, right to vote and some other rights. Well, the states, once these Confederate states were admitted back into the Union, they started putting laws on the books to pretty much roll those rights back. So now you have laws on the books like vagrancy laws. You have laws on the books that really puts Blacks really pretty much back into a state of servitude, because Blacks could not hold certain occupations. These were written into laws that a Black person could not hold a job and this was only in some states, because it first started, I think like the first Black codes were put on the book by, I believe, South Carolina and Mississippi. But after that, all of the southern states followed suit with putting their own Black codes or these Jim Crow laws on the books to restrict the movement and restrict the livelihoods of these newly freed slaves. They couldn't hold jobs other than farmer or laborer. And a lot of Blacks, or some Blacks at this time, were apprenticed. They knew how to build things, but they couldn't hold these jobs. So it was pretty much putting them in a position where they had to work back on the plantation again as farmers, where a lot of Blacks didn't want to do that. So then now you have these vagrancy laws that require Blacks to sign these type of contracts or agreements to state that they had to have a job. So these were reviewed every year. So if they didn't have a job, then that was punishable. They would get punished for that and fined. Well, if they couldn't pay the fine, then any white person could pay the fine for them. But now this black person owed money to this white person. These are usually like planters and, previous plantation owners that had money. So they would pay the fine for the black person, but now the black person was indebted to them. So they had to, by law, and these laws that were pasted on the book, had to go work for this white person. Another type of black code were apprenticeships. So once a person was considered a vagrant and they had children, these children became pretty much wards of the court, but they weren't wards of the court. They were wards of these plantation owners. So they would have to work the children of somebody that violated one of these vagrancy laws, not having a job, loitering. There was a lot of laws on the books that, some of them were trumped up charges, of course, because it was just a means to put blacks back into a state of servitude, really by force. And so then now they owned their children up to like 18 or 21. And the law stated that they can punish them, give them beatings. Now, an adult, if they were over 18, there were laws on the books that said that they could not give them a beating unless they had permission from a judge. But because these southern states and these officials were like Ku Klux Klan members, the Ku Klux Klan was started from previous Confederate soldiers. So a lot of them had a lot of animosity. They, and they were used to running the South the way that they wanted to. So you can assume that they weren't going to run to the court and get permission to whip someone when they can previously whip these people without any type of judicial intervention. And so it doesn't take a far leap to assume that that's what was going on at this time. There were other vagrancy laws that created separate court system to penalize blacks. Blacks couldn't testify in court against a white person. They could testify against another black. And so these courts were put into place to deal with things like larceny, vagrancy, theft, things of that nature. And they would, again, put these individuals back into a state pretty much of servitude. And so an example of that is in Louisiana, there's Angola Prison, which is still in existence today. The person that created the Angola Prison bought the plantation because it's considered, we're going post-Civil War. So this plantation was vacant. A lot of people had been killed. They had, been driven off their property. So these vast plantations were vacant. They were empty. Some people would purchase this property from the government, the union. So this person purchased this plantation, and his idea was to use the prison population, which were blacks, because blacks were 7 out of 10 prisoners were black at this time. This would allow him to lease out. This is where convict leasing started, where prisoners were released from the prison system. He actually was paid, I believe, $18,000 per year. Plus, he could keep the profit from the labor of these prisoners. These prisoners were used a lot for cotton. Like, he was the largest cotton farmer, I believe, in the United States at the time. All of this cotton was being produced, and these plantations and these farms were managed by slaves. Even his personal household was served by these prisoners. So they would cook for him and his family. They would do these household chores. They were like their servants, and they had to work from sun up to sundown. So it pretty much was just prison or slavery all over again. But this is an example of the convict leasing system and how it started, where these individuals, once they, if you couldn't pay a fine, if you found to be a vagrant, you couldn't pay these fines, or you committed some other type of crime, you were sent to prison. Well, most times, they weren't sitting behind bars like they are today. They were leased out to private individuals. They were leased out to farms. They were leased out to people that they did work for. So they pretty much were their slaves. And this allowed the South to really rebuild itself. And also it allowed the country to build the railroad system. So when you hear things like the chain gang, these are prisoners that were chained together and they were working on building railroads. So a lot of the railroad system in the United States was built by prison labor, were built by these chain gangs. There's a song that I'm going to play at the end by Gene Campbell called Levee Campman Blues. And this song was written by someone, and he was talking about the experience of working on a levee, which was one of the job functions that this prison labor, these chain gangs will work on. So we see that after the Reconstruction era, you have these states that are really, for lack of a better word, they're subverting the federal government. They're putting laws into place that are rolling back federal laws. And you may ask yourself, if you're a student of the law or have any background in the law, like, well, how can that happen? Because the federal Constitution states that if a state it states, when I say stated, it explains that if a state constitution is in conflict with the federal constitution, the federal constitution overrides that. So you might wonder, well, how did that happen? How were these states able to put things on the books that pretty much roll back federal law? So like voting. Some of these laws pretty much were in direct opposition of the federal constitution. But this just kind of gives you a feel of what was going on in these states, southern states, after the Civil War. Once they got their position back and they were admitted back into the Union, and the federal troops pulled out, they were able to govern themselves again. So really what their goal was prior to the Civil War, and the reason why they went to the Civil War, was pretty much accomplished, because they wanted to govern themselves. They wanted to be able to continue to have slaves. So when you have the convict leasing system and the vagrancy laws, this was the South's way of being able to do that. They wanted to be able to put blacks back in slavery. So this was a way for them to accomplish that goal, because the federal government pulled out. Now you have this Southerner that is the president now after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So he wasn't really intervening in what the South did. So when you always hear this cry of, oh, states' right, states' right, states' right, that goes back to this post-Civil War era where the South wanted to be able to govern themselves, or this confederacy which went to war. And even though they lost the war, they really won this ability to govern themselves. And it really was not about governing themselves because they felt like their way of government was better than the Union. It was really about these slaves and this slave labor and being able to deal with these slaves on their own terms. Because after the Civil War, you have the Freedmen's Bureau, which established schools for newly freed slaves, freed them, gave them medical care. They had their own pretty much judicial system where if there was complaints between blacks and white employers, they oversaw that process. They made sure that these newly freed blacks were paid. And so it was pretty much about the South being able to eliminate that. They didn't want anyone telling them how to deal with what they consider to be their property. They didn't want anyone ensuring and enforcing the fact that they had to pay these people. They didn't want blacks to hold positions in state governments and the Congress. They didn't want blacks to be able to freely move about. It was even a law, black code, that you couldn't even go to another state unless you were proven to be, someone of good character or good behavior. I believe you had to even get approval of a judge, if I'm not mistaken. So it was pretty much the same thing that blacks had to deal with in slavery, where in slavery, you couldn't move about from plantation to plantation. You couldn't move about freely. You had to have a paper. Same thing like after the Civil War, when the South got their power back, they required something written from the judge in order for blacks to move about. They couldn't move about like that, just like in slavery. And so it put them back. The states' rights cry is about that. It's not about the states feeling like the federal government is interfering and it's too much government, there's too many laws. It's not about that, because if that was the case, then if there was too many laws, they wouldn't have implemented all of these laws. It wasn't the union or the federal government that put all these laws on the books of what blacks can do, what jobs they can have. There was the southern states. These they were these Confederate states that start implementing all of these laws, start putting all of these laws on the books. A white couldn't marry a black person. So if it was about not having too much government or too much monitoring, then why then did they go full force and put all of these laws on the books to monitor pretty much every aspect of life of a black person? Then after that, then you have the Jim Crow laws that cropped up, where you start having segregation, where blacks couldn't go to the theaters, they couldn't go to restaurants. You have well-known entertainers during this time up until 1968, until the Civil Rights Movement, where they had to go through separate doors. They were entertaining places they were entertaining at. They weren't even given certain rights. Theaters and restaurants, they weren't able to sit in, and this is recent history. It may seem like a millennia ago, but this is recent history, where I can talk to people in my family just one generation back from me, and they'll tell me stories about schooling. They'll tell me stories where they couldn't drink out of a water fountain, water fountains were marked white and black. This is just one generation back from me. So this isn't a long time ago. And these laws stem from the South, and these individuals that wanted to continue to have control over these previously freed slaves, what they considered to be their property. They wanted to make sure that they can control them, that they would not rise up, and that they can exploit them. So at the end of the day, that is what is at the core of this. Of course, over time, it turned into hate, for skin color, and it turned into hate because of all blacks, stereotypes. They're lazy, they're A, B, C, and D, and that comes from, again, these vagrancy laws, where blacks, if they didn't have a job, you're a vagrant, and that was a crime at this time. And keep in mind, these crimes were punishable by death. A lot of these crimes were punishable by death, or sentenced him to a life of servitude. And a lot of these individuals that got sent to these prison camps, they had a short lifespan. It said that they had a shorter lifespan than a slave, because that's just how harsh their treatment was, and that's how difficult their life was, and what they were made to deal with. So when you hear this states' rights, federal rights, this fight or this debate, this goes back to slavery. This goes back to the southern states, former Confederate states, wanting to manage these newly freed blacks the way that they chose to. They wanted to be able to manage their labor. They wanted to exploit them. It turned into an issue of skin color over time. But at the end of the day, they wanted to be able to use them for labor and money, and not pay them, even in these camps where people worked on and they were supposed to be paid, like these levees where people worked on levees. And some of them, if they weren't prisoners, they worked on these levees because a lot of this was hard labor. And so blacks, wanting a job, would work on these particular types of jobs. And if they were said to, if it was agreed upon that they were going to be paid, so much, sometimes they wouldn't even see their pay. What are you going to do? You can't take a white person to court And if you do, the people that are sitting in these positions are these ex-Confederate or sympathizers. So it was just a really hard period of time. And so we see now that those same mindset and that same ideology still playing out today. And that is why a lot of people are protesting and asking that these things be changed, not out of just being rebellion and, oh, this is, playing the victim. Oh, here treating Black people like this. These are real issues. And when people talk about systematic racism, this is what they're talking about. Something that has been built in the system, like with these Black codes and these Jim Crow laws. This was built into the system, segregation, where you can't sit here and you can't do that. And although we have to keep in mind that when you have certain regions of the United States that are used to handling and dealing with things the way they choose, it may not be a law on the books that say, don't do this or you can't live here. You hear of things where Blacks weren't allowed to live in certain areas. Okay, that's not on the books. That wasn't a law. Those things were taken away after the Civil Rights Act, after those Civil Rights Acts were implemented. But it's now then where you have in these certain communities where it's just a known that you can't live there. And private individuals now are putting those certain types of wording into contracts where you can't sell to a Black person. Or if a Black person tries to move into that area, they catch hell. And so and it's a known that you don't go there. You don't go into that area. If you go into that area, you're going to be met with so much violence and so many problems that you're not going to want to live there. Then not rumors it's true. Then stories get circulated amongst communities like, oh, you can't live there. You don't want to move there. Now, there's no law that says that you can't live there, but there are stories where it's like an unwritten law, an unwritten rule that you're not wanted there. And if you try moving there, you're going to have a problem. Or if you do A, B, C, and D, you're going to have a problem. I know that. I've experienced that in my generation. So it's these unwritten rules that are able to continue on because you have these mindsets that are enforced by the law. That if you do try to go to court, then you're met with so much resistance. You're met with so much injustice that a lot of people don't even take things to court because they know what they're going to deal with. So when people speak of systematic racism, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about these laws. These are real laws that were on the books. And even now you have these unwritten laws of things that are going on. They said schools now are just, and I've watched some video or some documentary about this. I'm not sure which one it was, but it was talking about how schools are just as segregated as they are now prior to the civil rights movement. So you still have this segregation, again, these unwritten laws that are still marginalizing groups of people. So this is not people pulling a Black card or playing victim. These are real issues that occur. Prison systems, when people talk about that, those are rooted in convict leasing. When you had newly freed Blacks that were pretty much being forced to work again for their former masters, or if they weren't their former masters, they were people that wanted to become their master. Now with this whole situation, you have a whole economy that had collapsed, and people take advantage of that. You have this whole group of people, millions of people that are moving about, and they have to feed themselves. They have to live. But in some people's minds, they also had to be controlled. And so you have laws and you have institutions, you have certain practices that stem back to this era that we are still dealing with today. Another one of the Black codes was the labor contracts. And I talked about that a little bit, but just think about that. Think about the fact that you had to sign a contract to work for this particular person. And if every year these were checked, if you weren't working, this was a crime. You were being sent to go work in one of these prison, but you would be leased out. Your children would be taken away from you. But some people, if they chose not to do that, if they chose to say, hey, I'm not going to do that, then they would be met with other issues, pretty much forcing them. They were being forced to be in servitude again. So that is a Black code. Those are real laws that were placed on the books. So when you hear people talking about states' rights versus federal rights, know where that stems from. Our federal constitution was pretty much made null and void when it came to an entire group of people. It was made null and void by states' rights, by this ideology that these states should be able to govern themselves. But look at it. Look at history. Do the research for yourself. What were the states? Who were the states saying that? Was it New York? Was it California? What states were that? They were primarily southern states. What they were saying is, federal government, we don't want you in our business. We don't want you telling us to do with our newly freed slaves. We want to do what we want to do with them. And we don't want you nosing around in our business. And that's what that's all about. And so with that, I'm going to go on to this song. This is by Gene Campbell. It's called The Levee Camp Blues. And this is chronicling, I talked about this a little bit last week, how you can get a picture of what was going on at a certain time in history by listening to the music. And so this was chronicling actually an experience that I would say mostly Blacks. Of course, we know that even with the railroads, there were a lot of Chinese immigrants that built the railroad. Thousands of Chinese immigrants built the railroads, but there was a lot of prison labor, these convict leasings, and these chain gangs that built our railroad system and even our levee systems as well. So this song is just pretty much talking about this experience of working on a levee camp. And so before I go into this song, I just want to briefly touch on this week's tea inspiration. It is mint. Again, mint is just wonderful. So you're probably like, oh my God, the tea inspiration has been mint for like how many weeks? But mint is just it's a really versatile type of tea or herb, because teas are made from plants. They're made from, and they're created so that you can drink them. And so mint is very versatile. I mentioned last week that we're having a resurgence of the coronavirus. Peppermint is good for cough, soothing a sore throat. Orange mint is a certain type of mint that has a different type of a flavor to it. So you can locate that. It's not as easy to find. I'll put that on the page with the recording for this session. So if you want to go back and listen to it, and then if you want to look at, see where you can purchase orange mint, but it's not orange and mint. It is a type of a mint. It's called orange mint because of its flavoring. And so you can find that on our website. Go through Amazon and purchase it. But just know that mint is very versatile. It's good for sore throats. It's good for sinuses. It's good for a lot of different things. I'm not a doctor. I'm not trying to give medical advice, but hey, sometimes you have to, sometimes it's wise to take your health into your own hands. You don't want to leave your health in somebody else's hands. You don't want to leave your health in a government official's hand, sitting there waiting. I'm like, okay, I got to suffer here. Let me just stay in until they come out with a vaccine. And then they come out with a vaccine, everything's going to be okay. I was listening to a video last night of a doctor, and he was explaining, they were talking about the criteria for the vaccine. I think it's supposed to be out in early 2021. And the criteria is that it's 50% effective. And someone was asking, like, wait a minute, that means that if I take it, I'm pretty much saying it's a 50-50 chance that it's going to work. And he said, well, that is pretty much the effectiveness of our flu vaccine. It's only 40 to 60% effective. So that 50% that they've established it at being once before it can be rolled out, and amongst other things, is it being 50% effective. So even when the vaccine comes out, that does not mean it's going to work for you. So what does that say? That means you have to take your health into your own hands. You have to take care of yourself. You have to, if you do get sick, you have to be able, no one wants to sit around and be miserable. Sometimes you want some type of something to soothe you, so this is a way, mint again, is a way to be able to do that. No one wants to just sit and suffer. So you have to be able to know what you can use to be able to alleviate some symptoms. And I always say prevention is the best medicine. Social distancing, washing your hands. I know you may read a lot of stories and hear people saying, well, I did everything right and I still got it. That is true, but you still don't want to increase the chances that you get something by not washing your hands, by not doing the social distancing, by not wearing a mask, by trying to by staying away from crowds, by staying sheltering. Some places people are going to have to shelter in place themselves. Let's say like in Texas, I believe this, if it's not the entire state of Texas, but they're requiring masks now. But I think in the city of Houston, those hospitals, they're already over capacity. They're like at 102% capacity. So they're now, and I believe this was in Texas, or maybe it was in one of the other states, that now they're getting slammed, like Florida's getting slammed, Arizona, if I'm not mistaken. But some of these states, the hospital systems are having to make very difficult choices. They're having to make choices like, okay, well, who are we going to treat? Making decisions like, okay, well, how much lifespan does someone have? What is the likelihood of this person being healed from this, to determine who to treat? That's horrible. Like so those things, it's like, at the end of the day, prevention is the best medicine. Prevention. You can't keep yourself from everything. You may still become sick, but you can eliminate those odds. And if you do, there are ways that, because they're saying, a lot of times they can't, and even if you have severe symptoms now, what they're saying now in some of these states, that some people are not even going to be able to be treated. So best be wise and have things on hand that you can, alleviate some of your symptoms if this situation crops up for you or someone in your family. Again, I'm not giving medical advice. I use it. I'm sitting here now. I have I'm not sick though. So let me say that I don't have the coronavirus. Thank God. But I have my mint tea now. It's Kroger brand. It's not orange mint, but I mentioned this before. I love Kroger brand mint tea. But anyways, so I always keep that on hand because I have like really horrible allergies and sinuses. So I like to keep mint tea. So anyways, I'm going to play this song now from Gene Campbell, Levee Camp Blues. And if you have any questions, feel free to post those. You can post those on the page where this recording is posted. In these sessions, you can ask questions, and then on our various social media pages. So I hope you enjoyed this session. And I'm going to go ahead and play Gene Campbell's Levee Camp Blues.
Hey, contractor, they are getting so glad. Hey, contractor, they are getting so glad. They'll pay you half of your money and hold the other half back. ain't but to me that gets paid off. Ain't but to me that gets paid off. That's the commissary clay and the walking ball. I see somebody coming down to the water trough.